Hey guys, tonight we begin with a choice no one should have to make. 20 lashes at the whipping post tomorrow morning in front of the entire village. Or deliver 40 loaves of bread and 10 gallons of ale to the manor house by sunset. This is about crime sentences in 15th century England, where punishment wasn't fixed but negotiable, depending on what you could pay. It's about how justice became a marketplace where physical suffering could be converted to economic payment, and what that reveals about who the system actually protected and who it destroyed. It's about the quiet mechanics of how you swap lashes for fines, step by step, through a night of impossible calculations where every choice is terrible, and some people can afford to choose, while others just get whipped.
Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about how money changes the experience of justice, about systems where wealth determines whether you suffer physically or just financially, about the mathematics of converting bodily harm into commodity payments, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments whether you think this kind of commutation system is more or less fair than uniform punishment. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these explorations of how justice worked when it was explicitly for sale. Now settle in, and let's discover what happens when your sentence depends less on your crime and more on what you can afford to pay.
The manor is Thornfield in Yorkshire, and the year is 1463. England is in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, which means authority is unstable, and local lords have significant autonomy in administering justice. The manor court handles most criminal matters for the village and surrounding farms. Theft, assault, property disputes, public drunkenness, anything that disrupts community order gets adjudicated by the Lord's appointed magistrate, who is currently a man named Geoffrey Blackwood. He's held the position for 7 years, has a reputation for being strict, but willing to negotiate with people who can make negotiation worth his while. Robert Ashford is 28 years old and has just been sentenced to 20 lashes for stealing a sheep. He probably did steal the sheep. He needed to feed his family, and the sheep was there, and the owner is wealthy enough that one missing sheep shouldn't matter, except that property is property, and theft is theft, regardless of need. The sentence is standard. 20 lashes is the going rate for livestock theft when the value is under £5. Enough to hurt significantly, enough to serve as deterrent, not enough to permanently disable you, unless you're unlucky and the flogger is particularly enthusiastic.
But Robert doesn't have to accept the 20 lashes if he can pay the commutation fee. That's how Thornfield's justice system works. The court announces punishment, then offers the convicted person an option to pay instead. The payment isn't arbitrary. There's a formula. 1 lash equals 2 loaves of bread plus half a gallon of ale. 20 lashes equals 40 loaves and 10 gallons. The logic is that this is roughly equivalent value. A lash causes pain and humiliation. The bread and ale represent resources the convicted person must sacrifice to avoid that pain and humiliation. The court doesn't profit directly. The bread and ale go to the manor household or get distributed to the poor, depending on the lord's mood and the current food situation. But the magistrate who processes these commutations receives a small fee for the administrative work, so there's incentive to offer the option frequently.
Robert is told this immediately after sentencing. Geoffrey Blackwood explains it clearly. 20 lashes tomorrow at dawn, public whipping in the village square, or deliver 40 loaves of quality bread and 10 gallons of decent ale to the manor house by sunset tonight. Your choice. If you choose payment, you need to confirm by noon. If you don't confirm or don't deliver, the lashes happen tomorrow as scheduled. Simple.
It's not simple. Robert doesn't have 40 loaves of bread, doesn't have 10 gallons of ale, doesn't have the money to purchase them. His family are tenant farmers. They produce enough to survive and pay rent, and not much more. Getting 40 loaves would require buying grain, finding someone to bake it, paying for that baking, then transporting everything to the manor. The ale is easier because he could potentially brew it himself, but that takes time he doesn't have. He has maybe 12 hours to produce or acquire provisions worth several weeks of his family's income. It's technically possible, practically impossible. Unless he can borrow, unless he can negotiate, unless he can find some angle that makes this work.
He has until noon to decide. That's 6 hours. He goes home and explains the situation to his wife Mary. She immediately understands the problem. They can't pay. Even if they sold everything they own, they couldn't produce 40 loaves and 10 gallons by sunset. The commutation option isn't actually an option for them. It's for people with resources, people who have grain stored, people who have money, people who can call in favors from bakers and brewers. Robert has none of that, so he's going to get whipped tomorrow morning, 20 lashes, in front of everyone. The humiliation will be almost worse than the pain. Almost.
But Mary suggests something. They could borrow. Her brother has some money saved. Not enough for the full amount, but maybe enough for part. Robert's cousin owns a small brewery, might be willing to provide ale at reduced cost if they promise future labour. There's a baker in the village who owes Robert a favour from years ago, might be able to produce loaves overnight if the grain is provided. It's not impossible, just extremely difficult, and it would put them in debt for months, maybe years. But debt is better than 20 lashes, better than the physical damage and social humiliation, better than being marked as someone who got publicly whipped for theft.
Robert spends the morning desperately trying to assemble the commutation payment. Goes to Mary's brother first. Explains the situation. The brother is sympathetic but cautious. He has maybe £3 saved. That's enough for approximately 15 loaves if purchased from a baker. He'll lend it but wants it repaid within 3 months with interest. Robert agrees, has no choice, takes the money, goes to the baker. The baker, whose name is William, remembers the favour Robert did for him 5 years ago. Robert helped repair the baker's oven when it collapsed, spent 2 days working without charging because William was struggling financially at the time. William hasn't forgotten, agrees to bake 25 loaves overnight if Robert provides the grain and pays half the normal labour cost. It's generous by baker standards. Robert thanks him, still needs grain. Robert goes to the village mill, explains what he needs. The miller is less sympathetic, doesn't care about Robert's situation, wants full payment in advance for grain. Robert doesn't have enough money left after paying the baker, tries to negotiate, offers future labour. The miller refuses. Everyone offers future labour. Half the village owes me work that never gets done. Pay now or no grain. Robert returns home defeated. It's noon. He has to tell Geoffrey Blackwood whether he's paying or taking the lashes. He has enough money for 15 loaves, but no grain for the other 25. He has no ale at all. He can't pay. The decision makes itself. He'll take the 20 lashes tomorrow morning. Then Mary intervenes. She sold their second-best blanket to a neighbour for £2. It's not enough for full grain payment, but combined with what Robert has left, it might be. They return to the miller with the money. The miller accepts, provides grain. Robert takes it to William, the baker, who starts working immediately. Bread takes time to bake. He'll have 25 loaves ready by evening. Robert still needs 15 more loaves, plus all the ale. Robert goes to his cousin at the brewery, explains everything. The cousin, whose name is Thomas, agrees to provide 10 gallons of ale for cost of materials, plus a promise that Robert will work the harvest for him without wages. It's exploitative. Robert would normally earn money during harvest. Now he'll work for free just to avoid being whipped for stealing a sheep he stole because he was hungry. But he agrees, gets the 10 gallons in containers he'll have to return by tomorrow, takes them to his house. Progress.
It's early afternoon. Robert has secured approximately 25 loaves and 10 gallons of ale. Still needs 15 loaves. Uses the last of his money to buy grain from another farmer at markup prices because everyone knows he's desperate. Takes the grain to a different baker who agrees to produce 15 loaves by sunset for premium labour fees that Robert will pay later through a combination of money and work. Robert is now obligated to multiple people for debts he can't possibly repay in the short term. But he's going to avoid the lashes. That's worth generational debt, apparently. By sunset, Robert has assembled everything. 40 loaves, 10 gallons of ale. Loads it all onto a cart he borrowed from yet another person he's now obligated to. Transports it to the manor house, delivers it to the steward, who counts everything carefully. Verifies the bread is reasonable quality, the ale is drinkable, accepts the delivery. Stamps Robert's commutation papers. The 20 lashes are officially...
He returns home financially destroyed. He owes his brother-in-law £3 with interest. He owes William the baker labour costs. He owes Thomas the cousin an entire harvest season of unpaid work. He owes the second baker both money and future labour. He's obligated to return borrowed containers and cart. Altogether, Robert has incurred debts that will take at least a year to fully repay, possibly longer. But he didn't get whipped. His body is intact. His humiliation is private rather than public. By the standards of Thornfield's justice system, this is a success story.
Meanwhile, in the same village, another man named Peter serves his sentence the traditional way. Peter was also convicted of theft, stole bread from a market stall. Sentence was 15 lashes. Peter didn't have any resources, no family with money, no connections to bakers or brewers, no favours to call in. The commutation option was explained to him, 30 loaves and 7.5 gallons of ale by sunset. Impossible. He didn't even try, just accepted that he'd be whipped. The next morning, both men arrive at the village square. Peter for his whipping, Robert to witness as required for all major public punishments. Peter is stripped to the waist and tied to the whipping post. The flogger, the position is held by a man named John, who does this job for the court along with other enforcement duties, delivers 15 lashes with a leather strap. Each lash draws blood. By the 10th, Peter is screaming. By the 15th, his back is a mess of torn skin. He's cut down, given a rough cloth to press against the wounds, sent home to recover. No medical care, no compensation, just the physical damage and the public humiliation, and the expectation that he'll heal eventually, and learn not to steal.
Robert watches this, understands that he witnessed what almost happened to him, that his back could look like Peter's back if he hadn't been able to scrape together the commutation payment, that the difference between them isn't moral. Both stole, both were convicted, both deserved punishment, according to Thornfield's legal standards. The difference is purely economic. Robert had just enough connections and resources to avoid physical suffering. Peter had nothing and suffered accordingly. The justice system sorted them, not by guilt, but by wealth. That's the quiet part nobody says aloud, but everyone understands.
If you just felt that sick recognition, like watching a system that's obviously unjust operate completely legally, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way justice becomes commodity, the way punishment depends on payment capacity rather than crime severity, that's not ancient history. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want more of these explorations of how systems work when they're working exactly as designed.
The commutation system operates this way throughout Thornfield and similar manors across England. It's not universal. Some jurisdictions don't allow it. Some forbid commuting corporal punishment to fines.
But where it's allowed, it creates a two-tier system. People with resources pay their way out of suffering. People without resources suffer. The law treats them identically at sentencing, but differently at punishment. Both are convicted of theft. One pays in bread and ale. The other pays in blood and humiliation. The outcomes are dramatically different, despite identical crimes.
Robert spends the next year working off his debts. Every spare hour goes to fulfilling obligations. He works William's bakery at night, works Thomas's brewery during harvest, does odd jobs for the brother-in-law. Slowly, gradually, painfully reduces what he owes. The debt becomes his life. He's working constantly to pay for avoiding 20 lashes he never received. The physical punishment was swapped for economic punishment that lasts months instead of minutes. In some ways, it's worse. The lashes would have healed. The debt just accumulates interest and expands into new obligations.
But his back isn't scarred. That matters. In a society where physical marks identify you as criminal or unreliable or lower class, an unscarred back has value. Robert can still get hired for jobs that require trust, can still marry his daughter to someone respectable when she's old enough, can still maintain social position that would have been compromised by public whipping. The debt is worth it, according to that calculation. He's paying for something intangible but real. Maintaining reputation costs 40 loaves and 10 gallons and a year of indentured labor. That's apparently the going rate.
Peter recovers from his whipping after 6 weeks. The wounds get infected. He develops a fever, nearly dies, survives but with permanent scars across his back. Those scars mark him. Everyone knows what they mean. Peter was whipped. Peter is a thief. Peter can't be trusted. He struggles to find work afterward. People hire him for lowest-level labor, if they hire him at all. His earning capacity is permanently reduced. The 15 lashes he took because he couldn't pay commutation have lifetime consequences that Robert avoided through temporary debt.
Robert and Peter occasionally see each other around the village. Don't talk much. There's nothing to say. They both know what happened. Both understand the system. Robert got lucky, had just enough connections to assemble payment. Peter didn't, had nothing, and suffered accordingly. It's not personal, just how Thornfield's justice works. Physical punishment for the poor, economic punishment for people who can barely afford it. No punishment at all for wealthy who can easily pay fines. Everyone gets sorted into their category and receives appropriate consequences.
The mechanics of commutation become clearer to Robert as he learns more about how the system operates. The formula of 1 lash equals 2 loaves plus half gallon isn't arbitrary. It's calculated based on what the court determines is roughly equivalent value. A lash costs you pain and humiliation. The bread and ale costs you money and labor to acquire. The court is trying to make the options comparable, so people aren't obviously just buying their way out of punishment. Except they are, obviously. The equivalence is fake. 20 lashes takes 20 minutes and causes weeks of physical suffering. 40 loaves takes months of labor to pay for and causes years of financial suffering. They're not actually comparable, but the court pretends they are.
Robert also learns that the commutation payments don't just disappear. The bread gets distributed to the manor household staff and sometimes to the poor if there's excess. The ale goes to the manor stores. Some of it gets consumed by the lord and his guests. Some get sold. The court isn't purely extracting money. It's extracting resources that have practical value. That's why bread and ale specifically. They're staple goods that the manor uses constantly. Converting lashes to provisions means the court gets something useful from punishment beyond the deterrent effect of public whipping. It's efficient, practical, completely corrupt, but organized corruption,
where everyone benefits except the person paying.
Geoffrey Blackwood, the magistrate, profits from this system too. He charges a fee for processing commutations. Not much, maybe 5% of the total value. But with multiple commutations per month, it adds up. He's incentivized to offer the option frequently, to set commutation formulas that are just barely possible for people to pay, to maintain a system where physical punishment is the default, but economic punishment is available for anyone who can scrape together resources. It's elegant from his perspective. The court gets provisions, he gets fees. People with means avoid suffering. People without means learn important lessons about not stealing. Everyone wins, except the people who get whipped.
Robert finishes paying his debts after 14 months. 14 months of constant work. 14 months of owing multiple people. 14 months of being effectively indentured to creditors who helped him avoid 20 lashes. He's free now, in the sense that he doesn't owe anything, but he's also broken financially, has no savings, no margin for error. If anything goes wrong, if someone gets sick, if crops fail, if he gets accused of another crime, he has no resources to handle it. The commutation system didn't save him, it just shifted punishment from physical to economic, and extended the suffering over more than a year instead of one terrible morning.
Meanwhile, Peter has adapted to life with scars, found work where his reputation doesn't matter as much, does manual labor that pays poorly but steadily. He's not thriving, but he's surviving. The whipping destroyed some opportunities, but created a strange freedom. He has no debts, no obligations, no one he owes labor or money to. In some ways, he's better off than Robert, despite the starred back and reduced social standing. He paid his punishment immediately and completely. Robert is still paying, in the sense that his year of debt has left him vulnerable in ways that will take years more to recover from.
They're both victims of a system that sorts people by wealth and punishes accordingly. Robert had just enough to access the commutation option. Peter had nothing and took the whipping. Neither chose their starting economic position. Neither deserved radically different punishments for comparable crimes. But the system doesn't care about deserve, just about what you can pay. That's the quiet justice of commutation systems. Justice that appears to offer choice, but actually just sorts people by class and delivers punishment accordingly. Some people get options. Some people just get hurt.
Robert learns to be more careful after his experience, doesn't steal anymore, not because he's reformed morally, but because he understands viscerally what getting caught costs. The 20 lashes he avoided haunt him. The knowledge that he barely escaped physical punishment by incurring debts that consumed a year of his life. The awareness that if he's caught again, he might not have resources for commutation, might have to actually take the lashes, because you can only leverage family and friends so many times before they stop helping. The system worked. It deterred Robert from crime, but not through justice or rehabilitation, through making him calculate that crime costs more than he can afford to pay, regardless of whether payment is in blood or bread.
This is how crime sentences worked when they could be swapped. Not universally, not in all jurisdictions, but in places like Thornfield, where magistrates had discretion and commutation was established practice. You committed crime, got sentenced to corporal punishment, were offered option to pay instead. If you could assemble payment through any combination of existing resources, borrowed money, called in favors, and future obligations, you avoided the whipping. If you couldn't, you got whipped. The system maintained appearance of equal justice. Everyone convicted of theft gets 20 lashes, while implementing wildly unequal outcomes based purely on economic position. Rich people paid easily and walked away.
Poor people with connections paid with difficulty and survived financially damaged. Poor people without connections got whipped and marked permanently. 3 tiers, same crime, different justice. That's the legacy. That's how it worked. Step by step through a night of impossible choices, where some people have options and some people just have pain.
The commutation system operates smoothly in Thornfield for 3 more years after Robert's case. Geoffrey Blackwood processes maybe 20 commutations annually. Most succeed, some fail. The failures get whipped, the successes go into debt. The system sorts people efficiently into categories of wealth and delivers punishment accordingly. Nobody complains officially, because complaining about the system means questioning the magistrate's authority, which is dangerous. The quiet acceptance is how the system sustains itself.
Then something shifts. The Lord of Thornfield Manor dies. His son inherits. The new lord, Edward Thornfield, is 26 years old and has ideas about modernizing estate management. He's been educated in London, exposed to legal theories about consistent punishment and equal justice. He looks at the commutation system and sees what everyone else has seen but never said aloud. It's corrupt. It creates different justice for different classes. It allows wealthy people to buy their way out of physical punishment that poor people have no choice but to endure. Edward decides this isn't how his manor will operate.
He instructs Geoffrey Blackwood to stop offering commutation options. All sentences will be carried out as announced. No swapping lashes for bread and ale. No options. No economic alternatives to corporal punishment. Just uniform application of the law, regardless of ability to pay. It's principled. It's fair, by certain definitions of fairness. It's also going to cause massive disruption to social structures that have adapted to the commutation system being available.
Geoffrey tries to explain this to Edward, sits down with him privately, describes how the commutation system actually functions. The ability to pay commutation is a form of social pressure. People work harder, maintain better relationships, build community connections, all because they know that if they get into trouble, they'll need those resources and connections to avoid punishment. Remove the commutation option, and you remove incentive for people to build social capital. You make them more isolated, more likely to accept punishment as inevitable rather than something they can negotiate their way out of.
It's a sophisticated argument. Geoffrey is saying that the commutation system, despite being obviously unjust, creates social bonds, forces people to maintain relationships because they might need help assembling bread and ale payments someday, incentivizes people to help others with commutations because they might need similar help eventually. The system is corrupt, but it's functional corruption that produces community cohesion as a side effect. Remove it, and you might increase justice in theory while decreasing social functionality in practice. Edward doesn't care. The law should be the law. If the sentence is 20 lashes, everyone gets 20 lashes, whether you're rich or poor, whether you have connections or you don't. That's justice. What we've been doing is just allowing wealthy people to avoid consequences. It stops now. The new policy is announced. Effective immediately, all corporal punishment sentences will be carried out as stated. No commutations, no substitutions. The village reacts with shock. This has never been the rule before. People have built their lives around the assumption that if you get in trouble, you can potentially pay your way out if you have resources or can borrow them. Suddenly, that's gone. Suddenly, everyone is equally subject to physical punishment regardless of wealth. It's more just in one sense, more terrifying in another sense, because even people with means now face consequences they thought they'd never experience. The first test comes 6 weeks after the policy change. A merchant's son is convicted of assault, hit another man during an argument. The fight was witnessed, the injury was real. The sentence is 30 lashes. Under the old system, the merchant would have paid commutation immediately, 60 loaves and 15 gallons. Expensive but manageable for someone with merchant wealth. The son would have avoided the whipping. Everyone would have moved on.
Under the new system, there's no commutation option. The merchant approaches Geoffrey anyway, offers to pay double the standard commutation rate, offers to provide bread and ale, plus additional provisions, offers money directly. Geoffrey refuses all of it, explains that the policy has changed, that Lord Edward has forbidden commutations, that the merchant's son will be whipped tomorrow morning regardless of what his father can pay. The merchant is outraged. His son shouldn't be treated like a common criminal, shouldn't be subjected to public whipping like someone without means. But the policy is the policy. The whipping happens.
The merchant's son takes 30 lashes in the village square. It's brutal. By the 20th lash, he's unconscious. They continue anyway, because the sentence was 30, and you don't stop a sentence partway through. He's cut down afterward, carried home, takes weeks to recover. The wounds scar permanently. The merchant family's reputation is damaged, not because of the assault, but because their son was publicly whipped like a peasant. The social humiliation is worse than the physical damage. They consider leaving Thornfield, moving somewhere their shame isn't visible. But they have property here, a business, connections. They stay, but they resent Lord Edward and the policy that treated their son like someone without resources. This is the pattern that develops. People with means who thought they'd never experience corporal punishment suddenly face it. Can't buy their way out, can't negotiate, can't use wealth and connections to avoid physical suffering. They're furious, feel betrayed by a system change that affects them personally. Meanwhile, people without means experience something else entirely, relief mixed with resentment. Relief that finally everyone is subject to the same punishment. Resentment that it took a policy change to create equality, and that equality means everyone gets hurt, rather than everyone having options. Robert watches all this with complicated feelings. He's part of the merchant class now, sort of. Not wealthy, but established, has connections, could have assembled commutation payments if needed. The policy change means that advantage is gone. If he commits another crime, which he won't, he's learned his lesson, he'd face the same punishment as Peter faced years ago. No options, just lashes. Part of him thinks that's more fair. Part of him thinks the old system, corrupt as it was, at least gave people like him a chance. Now there's no chance, just uniform suffering. The village dynamics shift. People who used to maintain connections specifically for potential commutation needs don't need those connections anymore. Social bonds that were built on, "I might need to borrow money for bread if I get convicted," start fraying. Why help your neighbour with their problems if there's no possibility you'll ever need that favour returned in the form of commutation assistance? The community becomes less cohesive, more isolated. People look out for themselves rather than maintaining reciprocal obligations. Geoffrey was right about this consequence, even if his prediction was self-serving.
6 months into the new policy, crime rates haven't changed significantly. Deterrent effect is roughly the same whether punishment can be commuted or not. People who were going to commit crimes still commit them. People who were going to obey the law still obey it. The difference isn't in crime prevention, it's in who suffers and how. Under the old system, wealthy people avoided suffering through payment. Under the new system, everyone suffers equally. That's progress according to some definitions, tragedy according to others.
Then Edward makes his second policy change. If commutations aren't allowed for punishment, maybe they should be allowed for restitution. If you commit a property crime, theft, damage, trespassing, you still get the corporal punishment.
But afterward you can pay restitution to the victim in the form of goods or labor. The restitution doesn't replace punishment, it's additional, but it might repair relationships, might make victims whole, might serve justice in ways that just whipping people doesn't.
The new restitution policy is announced. It's voluntary. Victims can accept restitution or refuse it. Convicted criminals can offer it or not. But if both parties agree, the court will enforce the arrangement. Make sure the convicted person delivers what they promised. Punish them again if they don't. It's an attempt to add restorative justice on top of retributive justice, to have both physical punishment for deterrence and economic compensation for victims. Edward thinks this is sophisticated. Geoffrey thinks it's going to create new problems.
Geoffrey is right. The restitution system quickly becomes another form of class sorting. Wealthy convicted criminals offer generous restitution. Pay victims enough that the victims are almost glad the crime happened because the compensation exceeds the loss. Poor convicted criminals can't offer meaningful restitution, have nothing to give. Victims refuse to accept token payments that don't actually compensate for damages. So you get a situation where wealthy criminals are punished physically like everyone else, but then compensate victims financially, and everyone ends up satisfied. Poor criminals are punished physically and can't compensate victims, and everyone ends up angry. It's two-tiered justice again, just structured differently.
Robert observes this playing out through a case that directly affects him. His cousin Thomas, the one who provided ale years ago for Robert's commutation payment, is convicted of property damage. He accidentally burned part of a neighbor's barn while doing metalwork too close to the structure. The damage is significant, maybe £3 to repair. Thomas is sentenced to 15 lashes for negligence, takes them, survives, then approaches the neighbor about restitution, offers to repair the barn himself, provide labor and some materials, not full compensation, but something. The neighbor accepts. Thomas spends 3 months working evenings and weekends repairing the damage. By the end, the relationship is actually better than before the fire. The restitution process created reconciliation that punishment alone wouldn't have achieved.
But Thomas could only make that offer because he has skills and time and some resources. A poor person without construction abilities or spare time couldn't have offered meaningful restitution, would have just been whipped and left everyone angry. The system is working for Thomas, would fail for someone without his advantages. That's the pattern. Every attempt to make justice more fair ends up creating new ways to sort people by class and resources.
If you've been following this journey through medieval justice systems, you're seeing how every reform creates new problems, how attempts at equality just redistribute inequality differently. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to keep exploring these dynamics, and tell me in the comments whether you think Edward's reforms made things better or worse. I'm genuinely curious about your take.
Edward notices these patterns too. He's not stupid. He sees that eliminating commutation created uniform corporal punishment, but didn't eliminate class advantages. That adding restitution created new opportunities for wealthy people to buy better outcomes. He's frustrated, wanted to create equal justice, created different inequality instead. But he's also stubborn, believes that if he keeps adjusting the system, he can eventually get it right, can create a version of justice that treats everyone fairly, regardless of wealth or connections.
His third policy change is more radical. He announces that the manor will provide assistance for restitution payments to convicted criminals who can't afford them. A fund will be established. Poor people who commit property crimes can borrow from this fund to make restitution to victims. They'll owe the manor, but at least they'll be able to compensate people they've harmed. It's creative, it's unprecedented. It's also going to be expensive and complicated, and probably exploited immediately by people who see an opportunity for free money. The Restitution Fund launches with great optimism. Edward contributes initial capital from manor revenues.
announces that convicted criminals can apply for loans to make restitution. The loans are interest-free but must be repaid within 2 years through labour or money or both. If you default, additional punishment is imposed. It's structured to be helpful rather than exploitative. Edward genuinely wants to enable poor people to make restitution, wants everyone to have access to reconciliation opportunities that wealthy people naturally possess.
The fund is immediately overwhelmed with applications. Turns out lots of people have been convicted of crimes and couldn't afford restitution. They apply for loans. Most are legitimate, some are questionable. The manor doesn't have resources to investigate every application thoroughly, so they approve most of them, hand out loans, create massive new debt obligations throughout the village. Within 3 months, maybe 40 people owe the manor restitution fund money. Most are making payments, some aren't. The whole system is becoming administratively nightmarish.
Geoffrey tries to manage it, tracks who owes what, pursues people who miss payments, threatens additional punishment for defaults. But he's overwhelmed. The restitution fund created more work than anyone anticipated. Plus, it's breeding resentment. People who committed crimes and took their punishment without seeking restitution now see others getting loans and wonder why they didn't apply. People who paid restitution from their own resources feel cheated that others got manor assistance. The fund is creating as many problems as it solves.
Robert ends up involved when Thomas defaults on his restitution fund loan. Thomas borrowed 30 shillings to provide additional compensation to the barn owner beyond his labour. The compensation was accepted. The relationship was repaired. But Thomas can't repay the manor. He's tried, but harvest was poor and his own debts are crushing, and he just doesn't have the money. Geoffrey summons Thomas and warns him that defaulting means additional punishment, 20 lashes for violating the loan terms. Thomas is going to be whipped again for the crime of being too poor to repay a loan he took out to compensate someone for damages he'd already been whipped for. It's absurd, but it's the policy.
Robert tries to help, offers to cover some of Thomas's debt, but Robert doesn't have enough money either. His own financial situation is still recovering from the debts he incurred years ago for his commutation payment. He can contribute maybe 5 shillings. Thomas needs 30. The math doesn't work. Thomas is going to get whipped again for trying to do the right thing, for using a system that was supposed to help poor people make restitution, but actually just created new ways to punish poverty.
Thomas receives his 20 lashes 3 weeks later, his second public whipping. His back was barely healed from the first. Now it's destroyed again, scarred permanently. He can't work for weeks, can't earn money, falls further into debt. The restitution fund that was supposed to enable reconciliation has instead destroyed him financially and physically. Edward's reform, implemented with good intentions, has made Thomas's situation worse than if he'd just taken his initial punishment and left it there.
The village starts to understand something. Every attempt to make justice more fair for poor people ends up making things worse. The commutation system was corrupt, but at least you knew the rules. Knew that if you had resources or could borrow them, you had options. Knew that if you didn't, you'd be whipped. Simple, brutal, but clear. Edward's reforms have made everything complicated. You get whipped regardless of resources, but then there are restitution options, but then there are loans you probably can't repay, but then there's additional punishment for defaulting. The system is more elaborate, but not more just differently cruel.
Edward starts to recognize this too. He's spent 2 years implementing reforms, spent significant manor resources on the restitution fund, created administrative complexity that's overwhelming Geoffrey, and the results are mixed at best. Some people have genuinely benefited from the ability to make restitution with manor assistance.
Others have been destroyed by it. The system isn't working as intended. Edward wanted equal justice, created something that's complicated enough that nobody understands it anymore, including him.
6 months after Thomas's second whipping, Edward quietly reinstates commutation options, not exactly as before, with modifications. Now commutation is allowed, but only if you can pay immediately without borrowing. No extensions, no payment plans. You either have the bread and ale ready to deliver by sunset, or you take the lashes. The idea is to preserve equal treatment. Only people with actual means can commute, not people who can leverage future labor, while still giving wealthy people options that poor people don't have. It's a compromise. Returns to two-tier justice while trying to reduce the administrative burden of tracking debts and loans.
Geoffrey processes the return to commutation with relief. The restitution fund is closed. Outstanding loans are forgiven. Thomas and the 40 others who owe money are released from their obligations. The manor absorbs the losses. It's expensive, but Edward has decided that the cost of running the restitution fund exceeds its benefits. Better to just go back to a system everyone understands, even if that system is unjust. At least it's stable. At least it doesn't create cascading consequences that destroy people through unintended mechanisms.
Robert watches Edward's reforms rise and collapse over 2 years. Learns something about how systems work. Well-intentioned changes often make things worse. Attempts to help poor people often end up hurting them through mechanisms that weren't anticipated. Simple corruption that everyone understands is sometimes preferable to complex reform that nobody can predict. It's cynical wisdom. Robert doesn't enjoy having learned it, but he's seen it play out directly. Seen Thomas suffer more under Edward's reforms than he would have under the old system, seen the restitution fund turn into a debt trap, seen equal corporal punishment create social cohesion problems. Reforms failed, old system returned modified. Everyone is back where they started, except worse off for having experienced the failed experiment.
The modified commutation system works similarly to the original, but with harsher conditions. You can still swap lashes for bread and ale, but the formula has changed. Now it's 1 lash equals 3 loaves plus 1 gallon, making it more expensive, making it harder for borderline capable people to afford, making sure that only people with substantial means can use the option. It's explicitly two-tier justice now. Edward has stopped pretending otherwise, has accepted that his reforms failed, and that the best he can do is return to a system that at least functions predictably, even if it's unjust. Geoffrey administers this system with the same efficiency he administered the original, processes commutations, collects his fees. The difference is that fewer people can afford to commute under the new formula. Robert probably couldn't if he got convicted again. The payment would be 60 loaves and 20 gallons for 20 lashes. Impossible to assemble, even with borrowing. He'd take the lashes, would become like Peter, scarred, marked, reputation damaged permanently. The system has shifted such that people who were borderline capable before are now definitely incapable. The wealthy still have options. The poor get whipped. The middle is crushed. The village adapts to the modified system over the next year. Crime rates remain stable. Punishments happen regularly. Some people pay commutation. Most take their lashes. Social bonds that frayed during Edward's reforms slowly rebuild, but differently. People are more cautious, less willing to help others with commutation payments because the amounts are higher and the risks are greater. More focused on protecting their own resources rather than sharing with community members who might need help. The village becomes more individualistic, less communal. That's the legacy of Edward's failed reforms. Not better justice, just a community that's learned not to expect justice,
and not to help others pursue it.
Robert is 43 years old when Edward dies in a hunting accident. The next lord of Thornfield Manor doesn't bother changing the commutation system, just maintains what Edward left. The modified two-tier justice operates for another decade without significant changes. Some people pay their way out of punishment, most suffer physically. Everyone understands the rules. Nobody expects fairness. The system is stable, even if it's corrupt. That stability is worth something, maybe worth more than the failed attempts at reform that Edward tried. Maybe not. Robert isn't sure. He's just grateful he's managed to avoid committing any crimes that would put him back in front of Geoffrey, trying to assemble impossible amounts of bread and ale by sunset, or face lashes that would destroy his back and his reputation, and his ability to function in a society that marks convicted criminals permanently.
The mechanics of how commutation works, step by step through a night, remain the same. You get sentenced, you're offered the commutation option at a rate you probably can't afford. You spend desperate hours trying to assemble payment through any combination of resources, borrowing, and future obligations. If you succeed, you avoid physical punishment, but incur debts that take months or years to repay. If you fail, you take the lashes and live with scars. Either way, you're marked. Either way, you pay. Just different currencies, different timelines, different forms of suffering. The system doesn't care which you choose, just sorts you by wealth and delivers consequences accordingly. That's how it worked. That's how it still works. That's probably how it will always work, because every attempt to reform it has failed, and eventually people give up on reform and just accept that justice is for sale, and some people can afford it, while others just bleed.
Robert is 56 years old when he witnesses something that crystallizes everything he's learned about how commutation systems actually work. A young man named James is convicted of poaching, killed a deer on manor land. It's a serious crime, not capital, but close. The sentence is 50 lashes, enough to possibly kill someone if the flogger isn't careful, enough to definitely scar someone permanently and potentially disable them for life. It's harsh, but poaching is considered theft from the Lord directly, which carries maximum penalties.
James is 17. His family are among the poorest in the village. His father died 2 years ago. His mother is sick. His younger siblings are hungry. He killed the deer to feed them. Everyone knows this. Everyone sympathizes. But the law is the law, and poaching is poaching, regardless of why you did it. James is convicted, sentenced to 50 lashes. The execution is scheduled for 3 days from now to give him time to get his affairs in order, because there's a real possibility he won't survive.
Geoffrey Blackwood offers the commutation option mechanically. 50 lashes equals 150 loaves and 50 gallons of ale. Deliver by sunset in 2 days, or take the lashes. He doesn't expect James to pay. Nobody expects it. The amount is impossible. Everyone gets offered commutation, regardless of whether they can afford it. That way the system can claim it treats everyone equally, even though outcomes are wildly unequal.
What happens next surprises everyone. The village rallies. Not officially, not through any organized process, just spontaneously people start contributing. The baker offers 40 loaves. Someone else offers grain for 20 more. A brewer offers 10 gallons of ale, another 5 gallons. People Robert hasn't thought about in years show up with contributions. Small amounts mostly. 2 loaves here, 1 gallon there. But they accumulate. Within a day, the village has collectively assembled maybe 90 loaves and 30 gallons. Still short, but closer than anyone expected.
Robert contributes 10 loaves and 2 gallons. More than he can afford, but less than he wants to give. He's remembering when he was in James's position, desperate, trying to assemble impossible amounts.
The village didn't help him then. He had to scrape together everything through family and personal obligations. But James is younger. His crime is more sympathetic. His potential punishment is more severe. Something about the situation has activated community solidarity that Robert never received. He's not resentful exactly, just aware that the village chooses who to help and who to let suffer. James gets help. Robert didn't. Peter certainly didn't. The solidarity is real, but selective.
The village is still short by sunset of the first day. Maybe 60 loaves and 20 gallons remain to be found. Impossible for James's family, difficult for the village collective, but people keep contributing. Robert's wife, Mary, organizes the women to bake through the night. They use their own grain, their own labor, produce 20 more loaves by dawn. Other families do similar overnight efforts. By noon of the second day, hours before the sunset deadline, the village has assembled the full amount, 150 loaves, 50 gallons of ale, enough to commute James's sentence from 50 lashes to economic payment.
The delivery happens with most of the village present. It's not just James's payment, it's a collective statement. The village is saying something about itself through this act, that it can protect its young people when it chooses, that community solidarity is possible when the cause is sympathetic enough, that the commutation system, corrupt as it is, can be hijacked for purposes beyond just letting wealthy individuals buy their way out of punishment. The village has found a way to use the system collectively, to pool resources and save someone who couldn't save himself. It's remarkable, it's unprecedented, it's probably not replicable for less sympathetic cases, but it works this time. Geoffrey accepts the payment, verifies the quality, stamps James's commutation papers. The 50 lashes are officially converted to bread and ale. James is free, his back is unscarred, his future is intact in ways it wouldn't be if he'd taken the lashes and survived them. The village celebrates quietly. They've beaten the system, or at least worked within it, to produce an outcome that feels just. James was guilty, he'll face social consequences, but he won't face physical destruction. That matters.
Robert thinks about Peter while watching this. Peter never got village support. Nobody rallied for him. He took his 15 lashes alone, scarred permanently, marked as criminal. His crime was stealing bread. James's crime was poaching a deer. Both stole food because they were hungry, but James gets saved through collective action, while Peter got whipped. The difference isn't in the crimes or the laws, it's in how the village perceived them, how sympathetic they found the defendant, how much they identified with his situation. Justice remains arbitrary, even when it appears to be operating fairly. The mechanics work for James today, didn't work for Peter years ago, won't work for the next person, unless their circumstances trigger the same collective response.
But the success with James changes something in the village. People start to understand that commutation doesn't have to be individual, that communities can collectively pay to protect their members from physical punishment, that the system, designed to sort people by individual wealth, can be subverted by collective action. It's a dangerous realization from the manor's perspective. If villages start regularly pooling resources to pay commutations, the system loses its sorting function, stops separating wealthy from poor, becomes just another form of community taxation where everyone contributes to protect anyone who gets convicted.
Edward's successor as Lord of Thornfield Manor recognizes this threat 6 months later when another case produces similar commutation payment. A woman convicted of slander receives 30 lashes as sentence. The village assembles 90 loaves and 30 gallons within 2 days, pays her commutation collectively. The Lord is displeased, summons Geoffrey, asks why the village is organizing to subvert the punishment system. Geoffrey explains that the law allows commutation for anyone who can pay, doesn't specify that payment must come from individual resources.
The village is operating within the system's rules, just using those rules in ways the system didn't anticipate.
The Lord considers changing the rules, forbidding collective payments, requiring that commutations come from the convicted person's own resources only. But that's difficult to enforce. Money and goods are fungible. How do you prove whether bread came from the convicted person's household or from neighbors who contributed? How do you distinguish between legitimate family support and illegitimate community organizing? The mechanics of enforcement are impossible. So the Lord does nothing, just notes with displeasure that the commutation system is being used in ways he doesn't approve of but can't prevent.
Over the next 5 years, the village develops informal rules about when to organize collective commutations. Sympathetic cases where the crime was driven by necessity and the punishment is severe warrant collective action. Unsympathetic cases where the crime was malicious or greedy do not. The village essentially adds another layer of judgment on top of the court's judgment. The court determines guilt and punishment. The village determines whether that punishment will actually be inflicted or collectively commuted. It's grassroots justice overriding formal justice, using the system's own mechanisms to implement community values that don't always align with legal values.
Robert participates in maybe 10 collective commutations over those 5 years, contributes what he can afford. Sometimes his contribution makes the difference between success and failure. Sometimes he's just one of many small contributors. The collective action feels good, feels like the community is finally using the corrupt commutation system for purposes beyond just protecting the wealthy. But Robert also notices who doesn't get collective support. People convicted of crimes against community members rather than abstract crimes against the Lord. People who aren't well liked, regardless of crime severity. People whose families have bad reputations. The collective solidarity is selective, not universal, still sorting people just by different criteria than wealth alone.
Thank you for staying with me through this complex exploration of how justice systems can be both subverted and reinforced through community action. If this changed how you think about collective resistance to unfair systems, about how communities choose who deserves protection, about the ways corrupt mechanisms can be repurposed for better ends while still maintaining underlying injustices, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your reflections. What would you do if your community faced these choices? Where's the line between helping individuals and enabling systems? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on these impossible questions.
The commutation system continues operating in Thornfield through the end of the 15th century and into the 16th. The collective payment innovation spreads to other villages. Not universally, not everywhere the system exists, but in communities where social cohesion is strong enough and sympathetic cases trigger the right response. Manor lords across England notice this trend. Some try to forbid it. Some succeed in preventing collective payments. Others fail, like Thornfield's lord failed, because enforcement is impossible without fundamentally changing how commutation works.
Some jurisdictions respond by eliminating commutation entirely. If villages are going to organize collectively to subvert the sorting function, better to just impose uniform corporal punishment and remove the economic alternative. This happens in maybe a quarter of places that previously allowed commutation. They switch to mandatory physical punishment. No options, no ability to pay, just lashes for everyone regardless of resources or community support. It's arguably more fair, definitely more brutal, eliminates the corruption of two-tier justice by making everyone suffer equally. Progress through increased universal cruelty rather than decreased selective cruelty.
Other jurisdictions modify their formulas to make collective payment harder.
Increase the ratio so it's 3 loaves per lash instead of 2 or 4 or 5. Make the amounts so high that even collective action can't assemble them. Price the commutation option out of reach for communities, while keeping it accessible for truly wealthy individuals. It's explicit class sorting now, not even pretending that anyone except the rich can use commutation. At least it's honest. The system stops pretending to offer equal opportunities and just admits it exists to protect wealthy people from consequences, while everyone else suffers.
Thornfield maintains its system with the modified ratios that Edward implemented: 3 loaves per lash, 1 gallon per lash, high enough to prevent most individual commutations, low enough that collective action can sometimes succeed. The Lord has accepted that he can't fully control how the system operates, can't prevent villages from organizing when they choose, can't force people to watch their neighbors get whipped when collective resources could prevent it. The best he can do is make commutation expensive enough that it only happens for cases where the village really commits. That's the compromise. The corruption continues. The collective subversion continues. Both operate simultaneously in tension that never fully resolves.
Robert is 68 years old when he sees Peter for the last time. Peter is dying, sick with something respiratory that the scarred tissue on his back has somehow made worse. Robert visits him in the hut where Peter has lived alone for 30 years since his whipping. The scars are still visible, still mark him, still define how people see him even decades later. Peter is bitter, but not about what Robert expects.
"I should have stolen more," Peter says. "If I'd stolen enough to actually improve my situation, the whipping would have been worth it. But I stole bread worth maybe 3 pennies, got 15 lashes, marked for life, for 3 pennies worth of bread. The punishment exceeded the crime by such magnitude that it makes the crime seem trivial. I should have stolen something valuable, made the suffering worthwhile."
Robert doesn't know how to respond to this. Peter is saying that if you're going to suffer severe punishment, you might as well commit crimes worth punishing severely. That proportionality in justice systems matters, because disproportionate punishment teaches the wrong lessons. That Peter's mistake wasn't stealing bread, but stealing too little bread to justify the consequences. It's dark reasoning. Robert understands it, can't argue against it because Peter is right. If you're going to get marked as a criminal and suffer publicly regardless of crime severity, you might as well commit serious crimes. The system's failure to calibrate punishment to offense severity incentivizes worse behavior rather than better.
Peter dies 3 days after that conversation. Robert attends the burial. Few others do. Peter was marked 30 years ago and never recovered socially. Died alone and poor. The whipping he took because he couldn't pay commutation defined his entire life. He never got another chance, never rebuilt his reputation, never escaped the consequences of being too poor to swap lashes for bread. Robert thinks about the fact that he avoided Peter's fate through luck and connections, that if a few things had gone differently, Robert would be the one dying marked and alone, that the system sorted them arbitrarily, and Peter happened to land on the wrong side, while Robert landed on the barely acceptable side.
The commutation system survives into the 17th century, gradually declines as centralized courts take over more criminal justice functions. Fewer cases are handled by manor courts. More go to county courts, where commutation options don't exist or exist under different terms. By the mid-1600s, the practice of swapping lashes for bread and ale is rare, still legal in some places, still operating in traditional jurisdictions, but fading, being replaced by monetary fines that are cleaner to administer, less dependent on delivery of physical goods, easier to track and enforce.
The transition from goods-based commutation to money-based fines eliminates some problems, creates others. Money is more fungible than bread, easier to pay, harder to verify value. The corruption becomes more abstract, but doesn't disappear.
Robert lives to see this transition begin. He's 74 when Thornfield Manor starts accepting monetary fines instead of bread and ale for commutations. The ratios change. 1 lash equals 2 shillings. It's simpler. You commit crime, get sentenced, offered option to pay money instead of taking lashes. If you have the money, you pay. If you don't, you bleed. Same logic as the bread and ale system, same sorting mechanism, just more efficient administratively. The community can't easily organize collective monetary payments because money is tracked differently than goods. Can't show up with bags of coins collected from 50 households without raising questions about how that money was assembled. The transition to monetary fines kills the collective subversion that villages had developed, returns the system to individual wealth sorting, progress for the manor, regression for community solidarity.
The last case Robert witnesses under the bread and ale commutation system happens in 1641. He's 79 years old, barely mobile, but he attends because the convicted person is his grandson. The young man was caught fighting, assault, 15 lashes. The old formula would require 45 loaves and 15 gallons, but Thornfield is transitioning to monetary fines. The magistrate offers both options, 45 loaves and 15 gallons by sunset, or 30 shillings immediately. The grandson has some money saved. Not enough for 30 shillings, enough for maybe 20. The village could organize collectively to provide the bread and ale. Did it successfully for James 50 years ago, could do it again. But the village has changed, become less cohesive, less willing to organize collectively, more focused on individual survival in increasingly difficult times. Nobody steps forward to help. The grandson tries desperately to borrow the remaining 10 shillings, fails, takes the 15 lashes.
Robert watches his grandson get whipped, watches the same system that he barely escaped destroy the next generation. The scars will mark the young man, limit his opportunities, define him as criminal. Robert is too old to stop any of it, just witnesses, understands that the cycle continues, that every generation faces the same impossible choices, that the mechanics of swapping lashes for payments remain fundamentally unchanged even as the specific currencies shift, that wealth determines who suffers and who doesn't, that the system works exactly as designed, that generations of people have tried to reform it or subvert it or make it more fair and mostly failed, because the underlying logic that physical punishment can be converted to economic payment for people who can afford the conversion is too useful to people in power to ever fully eliminate.
Robert dies in 1642, at age 80. His obituary, if he'd had one, would probably mention that he was a farmer who lived through interesting times, that he witnessed changes in how justice was administered, that he was respected in the community. It wouldn't mention that he barely escaped being whipped for stealing a sheep, that he spent a year working off debts incurred to avoid 20 lashes, that he watched the commutation system operate for 50 years, that he saw it briefly subverted by collective action, and then saw that subversion fail as the system evolved to prevent it, that he learned everything about how justice works when it's explicitly for sale, and came away believing that no reform can fix systems designed to sort people by wealth. That knowledge dies with him, largely unrecorded, except in the memories of other people who went through similar experiences and reached similar conclusions.
The bread and ale commutation system fades almost completely by 1650, replaced by monetary fines that are easier to administer and harder to collectively subvert. The transition is framed as modernization, more efficient justice,
better record-keeping, cleaner processes. All true. Also true that it eliminates the brief period where communities figured out how to use the system collectively, returns to pure individual wealth sorting, where only personal resources matter. Progress by some definitions, regression by others. The manor lords prefer the new system. The wealthy remain unaffected either way. The poor lose the small window where community action could sometimes save them. That's modernization, making systems more efficient at doing what they were always designed to do, sorting people by class and delivering consequences accordingly.
Modern historians examining commutation systems often focus on the corruption, the obvious injustice of allowing wealthy people to buy their way out of physical punishment, the two-tier system where identical crimes receive different punishments based purely on ability to pay. All of this is true, all of it is worth criticizing, but what historians sometimes miss is the brief period where communities subverted these systems, used them collectively, organized to protect members who couldn't protect themselves. That period was short, maybe 30 years in places like Thornfield, less in most jurisdictions. It failed, ultimately, because the systems evolved to prevent collective action. But it happened. Communities figured out how to hijack corrupt mechanisms for better purposes. The fact that manor lords then modified the mechanisms to prevent this doesn't erase that it happened, just proves that power adapts when resistance threatens its interests.
The legacy of commutation systems isn't just the corruption, it's the demonstration that justice is negotiable when you have resources and fixed when you don't, that systems designed to sort people by wealth will sort people by wealth, regardless of how many reforms you attempt, that brief windows of collective resistance can open but will close when power recognizes the threat and adapts, that the choice between lashes and bread isn't really a choice for most people, that the system maintains appearance of fairness, everyone gets offered the option, while implementing radical inequality in outcomes. That's what lash-to-fine commutation reveals about quiet justice and survival.
Quiet justice operating through mechanisms where punishment depends on payment capacity. Survival meaning either having enough wealth to buy your way out, or having enough community support to be worth protecting, or having scarred back and destroyed reputation because you lacked both. The step-by-step process of swapping lashes for bread starts with sentencing and ends with either delivery of goods or public whipping. But the real process is the night between sentencing and deadline. The desperate calculation of what you can afford, what you can borrow, who will help, whether collective action might save you, whether you're sympathetic enough to warrant that action. The mathematics of converting bodily harm to commodity payments, the economics of choosing between physical suffering now and financial suffering for months, the social dynamics of who gets help and who bleeds alone.
That's how it worked. That's what it reveals, that justice systems advertise equality while implementing inequality, that wealth protects people from consequences while poverty exposes people to full force of punishment, that brief periods of resistance and community organizing can subvert these systems temporarily before power adapts and closes the loopholes, that every generation faces versions of these same impossible choices under systems that evolve their mechanisms while maintaining their fundamental logic, that the lashes get swapped for bread, for ale, for money, for whatever currency is currently useful to authorities, while the underlying transaction remains constant, physical suffering converted to economic extraction for people who can afford the conversion, physical suffering imposed directly on people who cannot. That's the legacy, that's the pattern, that's what persists across centuries of supposed reform and modernization.
Robert understood this by the end of his life, understood that the system he barely escaped at 28 was fundamentally unchanged by the time his grandson faced it 50 years later. Same logic, different currencies, same sorting, different mechanisms, same outcomes. Some people buy their way out, some people suffer. The system works exactly as designed, always has, probably always will, because the design serves people in power too perfectly to ever be fully dismantled. Justice that appears neutral while implementing class hierarchy. Punishment that appears fixed while being infinitely negotiable for those who can negotiate. That's the quiet part. That's what the bread and ale and money and suffering are all ultimately about. Maintaining power structures through the fiction that justice is fair when everyone knows it's for sale, and the only question is whether you can afford the price.
The formula doesn't matter. 1 lash equals 2 loaves or 3 loaves, or 2 shillings or 5 shillings. The specifics are arbitrary. What matters is that conversion exists for some people and not for others, that the system maintains this distinction while claiming to offer equal treatment, that this claim of equality enables the system to operate with social legitimacy, despite obviously unjust outcomes, that people like Robert spend their lives navigating between the barely capable and the definitely incapable, that people like Peter spend their lives marked by their inability to navigate that successfully, that people like James get saved by collective action that might not exist for the next person, that the cycle continues generation after generation because every attempt to fix it runs into the fundamental problem that the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. The corruption is the point, the sorting is the purpose. The appearance of choice masks the reality that choice only exists for people who can afford to choose.
And that's what crime sentences that swap lashes for heavy bread and ale fines reveal about quiet justice and survival. Justice that operates quietly through economic mechanisms. Survival that depends on wealth, connections, community standing, and luck. Step by step through nights of impossible calculations. 40 loaves by sunset, 10 gallons by morning, 20 shillings immediately, 30 lashes tomorrow. Calculate, borrow, beg, organize, or bleed. Those are the options, have always been the options, will probably remain the options as long as justice systems exist that allow punishment to be negotiable for people who can pay, while remaining fixed for people who cannot. That's the truth. That's the pattern. That's what the bread and ale and money and scars and impossible choices all ultimately mean. Some people have options. Some people just have pain. The system sorts efficiently, has always sorted efficiently. That's its purpose. That's its legacy. That's what Robert learned across 50 years of watching it operate without fundamental change, despite countless reforms and modifications and attempts to make it more fair. The mechanisms change. The sorting continues. The quiet justice persists.